Do you believe that there are truly evil or truly good people in the world? Would you consider yourself to be all of one or a mix of both? Well, in this strange and sinister tale of Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde, we meet two men who seemingly dwell on opposite ends of the spectrum. But the strangest thing of all is that these two men seem to be in cahoots. The story begins through the perspective of Mr Gabriel John Utterson, or Utterson for short. He's a very good lawyer. Utterson's not overly friendly, but he's a decent, sensible guy. He also tries not to be too judgmental towards others. Because of these good traits, Utterson has friends from different levels of London's society. Many are affluent and influential, while some are less so. Aside from being very tolerant of different kinds of people, Utterson is also a loyal and reliable friend. That explains why, on this fine Sunday, he is taking his usual walk with his distant relative, Mr Richard Enfield. He looks forward to this walk every week. As is typical on Sundays, the streets are a little quieter than usual. During the week, London streets are alive with people hawking their wares and doing business, but today, both men enjoy the relative tranquility. As the two men make their way down these streets, they come across a sinister-looking building. Mr Enfield stops Mr Utterson and points out the door to the building. It's a two-storey house, but quite run down, and has homeless people sheltering in its recesses. Mr Enfield tells Mr Utterson that the house reminds him of a strange incident that happened not long ago. It was a dark winter's morning. At around 3 a.m, Mr Enfield was walking home when he witnessed a terrible thing. A little girl was running full steam down one street and collided heavily with a man who'd been walking up the cross street. When they crashed at the street corner, instead of helping the little girl, the man stomped on her. He just trampled over her like she was garbage and left her screaming on the ground. Then the villain strode away, calm as anything, while the child lay there shrieking in pain and terror. Mr Enfield was incensed. It took a lot of shouting and calling on his part, but Mr Enfield chased the villain down and brought him back to the scene by the collar. At this point, a small crowd had gathered around the little girl. She was more frightened than injured, but the crowd were furious. Mr Enfield had never seen anything like it. The girl's family was screaming bloody murder at the man. Even the doctor joined in. But it was easy to see why. On closer inspection, the mysterious man was ugly. No, not just ugly, loathsome. There was something repugnant about him, not a clear physical deformity, but it was like looking in the face of the devil himself. His sickening appearance had made Enfield break out in a cold sweat. Before things could escalate, the man pacified the crowd by agreeing to give money to the girl's family. Enfield and a few others negotiated it up to £100. But where would the man get the money? Well, the mysterious man walked the crowd up to this very door they were standing at right now. He whipped out a key, went inside, and re-emerged with some gold and a cheque for the balance. But strangely, this cheque wasn't signed in his name. It was signed by someone else. Now, since he was such a repulsive creature, it was hard to trust that the cheque would actually work. So the next morning, Mr Enfield, the girl's father, the doctor, and this mysterious man went down to the bank together to make sure his cheque would clear. And the crazy thing is, it did. Mr Utterson listens to the story in thoughtful silence. Mr Enfield then reveals the name of the child-stomping devil, Mr Hyde. Now, Mr Utterson has his own little secret to reveal. He knows who signed that cheque. He makes sure that Mr Enfield agrees to never speak of what he saw again. That evening, Mr Utterson is feeling grim. Usually, he sits at home on Sunday evenings and reads to unwind. But tonight, he goes over to his safe and takes out a document titled Dr Jekyll's Will. This will states that if Dr Jekyll dies or disappears for more than 3 months, then his friend, Mr Edward Hyde, will inherit everything. That's right. The same brute who trampled a defenceless little girl stands to inherit a fortune. And what's all this about disappearing? Is the respected Dr Jekyll in trouble with the wrong kinds of men? Perhaps he's being blackmailed. Even though he'd written the will according to Dr Jekyll's strict instructions, Mr Utterson has always hated that document. Now, after what Mr Enfield has revealed, Utterson is feeling extra nervous for Dr Jekyll. Not only is he a long-standing client, but he's also an old pal. Whatever the curious connection is between Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde, Utterson must know the truth. Immediately, he goes to visit another old chum, Dr Lanyon. When they were younger, the 3 of them, Jekyll, Utterson and Lanyon, were the best of friends. Mr Utterson is now depending on Dr Lanyon's memories and knowledge of Dr Jekyll to shed light on this bizarre turn of events. At his house, Dr Lanyon admits that he and Dr Jekyll have grown apart over the last 10 years. There's no malice between them, but Dr Lanyon disapproves of the unscientific balderdash that Dr Jekyll has been mixing in. Dr Lanyon doesn't elaborate, nor has he ever heard of Mr Hyde. Mr Utterson has no choice but to go home and regroup. He's not giving up yet. Poor Dr Jekyll must be in trouble of some kind. Mr Utterson can't sleep that night. The more he tosses and turns, the more questions he has about Jekyll's predicament. So he comes up with a desperate plan for this desperate situation. Mr Utterson starts to haunt the door of the so-called Mr Hyde. Every morning, sometimes so early in the morning that it's still night, he lingers in the area and keeps a lookout. Risky. Finally, on a clear, frosty night, a small figure approaches the doorway. He is plainly dressed, but something about him seems wrong. He draws a key from his pocket, like he's coming home. Mr Utterson steps out from the shadows and touches the man's shoulder as he passes. Could this finally be Mr Hyde? Alarmed, Mr Hyde shrinks back from Mr Utterson's reach. He asks him what he wants. Mr Utterson reveals that he is an old friend of Dr Jekyll's and would like to come in. Mr Hyde tells him Dr Jekyll is not home. Persistent, as any good lawyer should be, Mr Utterson insists on seeing Mr Hyde's face so that he might recognise him again. Mr Hyde allows him to have a look, but disappears into the house soon after. Stranger and stranger. Mr Utterson's attempts at finding answers have only given him more questions. It's time to go to the source of all this mystery. Utterson makes a beeline for Dr Jekyll's house to speak to the man himself. At Dr Jekyll's house, he is greeted by his butler, Mr Poole. Sadly, it seems that Dr Jekyll is out. He asks Poole about Mr Hyde. Who is Mr Hyde really to Dr Jekyll? Is Mr Hyde often allowed into Dr Jekyll's laboratory? Poole is polite but vague. Is he hiding something? He simply reveals that Mr Hyde has a key, never dines with Dr Jekyll, and all the household staff have been told to obey him. Mr Utterson has no choice but to go home heavy-hearted and empty-handed that evening. Anxiety gnaws at him. He smells a scandal. He's afraid that the evil Mr Hyde is coercing or blackmailing poor Dr Jekyll into doing his bidding. Mr Utterson resolves to help his friend out of this mess. 2 weeks later, Dr Jekyll decides to throw a fun dinner party for his closest friends, all reputable, intelligent men. After the guests leave, Mr Utterson confronts Dr Jekyll about the degenerate Mr Hyde. He knows it's a touchy subject, but they're good friends, and it's a conversation that must be had. Dr Jekyll immediately pulls back from Mr Utterson's attempt to discuss his connection to Mr Hyde. But Mr Utterson is too worried for his friend to back down. He tells Dr Jekyll that he doesn't like the idea of Mr Hyde being included in Jekyll's will. But Dr Jekyll is weirdly defensive. He reassures Utterson that he can be rid of Mr Hyde whenever he chooses. But for now, Mr Hyde is sticking around, and they should drop the subject altogether. Oh, this must be bad. Whatever Jekyll has got himself into, Utterson has no doubt he can get him out of it. All Jekyll needs to do is say the word. But the conversation is over. Mr Utterson expresses his dislike for Mr Hyde, but promises to honour Dr Jekyll's will if the time comes. So, if you're thinking that this is a strange tale, we're only just getting started. How can these two wildly different men somehow be related? Were they thrown together by choice? Or has there been foul play? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.